This is the Soviet Death Star. It's an orbital station outfitted with a formidable laser weapon that was engineered for combat in Earth's orbit. Today, deploying weaponry in space may be a contentious issue, but the concept is far from novel. This scenario unfolded previously during the 1980s, which presents us with a valuable chance to extract lessons from our own history. Let's discuss Star Wars. No, not that particular Star Wars. The actual Star Wars was a space-positioned missile defense framework that was advocated by United States President Ronald Reagan. The concept envisioned Americans deploying a network of interceptor satellites into Earth's orbit. These orbital weapons would possess the capability to identify ballistic missile launches from the ground and eliminate them during their ascent. This would fundamentally neutralize the Soviet nuclear weapons stockpile. That represented a remarkably audacious proposal for that era. During the 1970s, diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union had actually been improving considerably. We transitioned from the Cuban Missile Confrontation of the 1960s that nearly eradicated civilization as we understand it to an era of apparent negotiation and collaboration. However, appearances can be misleading, so bear that in mind as we navigate through this web of political deception. For instance, there was arguably no greater symbol of Cold War solidarity between East and West than the Apollo-Soyuz mission of 1975, the global community, observed as an American vessel and a Soviet vessel rendezvoused in orbit and connected together. What ensued was 2 days of the inaugural international gathering in space. The crews collaborated on scientific investigations together. They traded gifts, partook in meals, and even experienced each other's music. On the surface, it appeared that everyone was cooperating harmoniously. In the meantime, what the world remained unaware of was that merely 1 year earlier in 1974, the Soviets had actually deployed a classified military orbital station into space that was equipped with a machine gun. And they didn't just launch the first firearm into space, they also discharged the first firearm in space. This wasn't any kind of sophisticated space weapons platform. Not at that point. Essentially, they had removed a gun from a military aircraft and fastened it to a compact space station. It wasn't even connected to a mechanism that would allow you to direct the gun. The entire orbital station had to be oriented in the direction they intended to fire. It was only test-fired on a few occasions, primarily due to concerns that the recoil from the weapon would puncture a hole in the spacecraft's wall and everyone aboard would perish. Regardless, all of this space militarization wouldn't remain concealed for much longer. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected as the 40th President of the United States. And once he assumed power, Reagan didn't waste considerable time implementing major transformations. We generally refer to this period as Reaganomics. The president reduced government expenditure, decreased taxes, eliminated regulations on private enterprises, and established free trade. For the most part, Reagan was a limited government type of leader. But one domain where he did support a firm approach was with the United States military and the continuing Cold War with the Soviet Union. You understand how significantly sound influences the atmosphere of space. The appropriate music can make a remote planet feel inhabited, or transform a silent orbit into something deeply moving. For an upcoming video, we are constructing a complete three-dimensional sequence, something cinematic that reveals space to you in a way cameras cannot. And I've been utilizing a tool called Suno to generate all the music for it. Suno is an artificial intelligence music creation tool that enables anyone to produce original songs within minutes. But what's distinctive about it is how it amplifies your creativity instead of supplanting it. I've been using it to explore tones, textures, and rhythms for this sequence. I began with a straightforward prompt: orchestral science fiction score with ambient synthesizers and a sense of discovery. Within seconds, Suno provided me with several variations that actually sounded impressive. Not AI-generated impressive, but emotionally authentic. From there, I could separate stems, remix segments, and mold the score around the timing of the visuals. It's like possessing a studio at your disposal without sacrificing any of the creative authority. If you produce videos, podcasts, or simply enjoy experimenting with sound, Suno makes it feasible to create something professional without requiring years of musical training. And since you receive full commercial rights to everything you produce, you can actually utilize your tracks anywhere, even in monetized projects like this one. I've genuinely had an incredible time using it, and it's remarkable how rapidly it's become integrated into my workflow. So if you've ever desired to create your own soundtrack for a video, a game, or simply for enjoyment, visit Suno.com And when that three-dimensional sequence debuts, every note you hear in it will be music we created ourselves using Suno. Instead of attempting to reduce the threat of nuclear conflict through diplomacy and collaboration, Reagan selected a massive network of weapons satellites. Technically, this was designated as the Strategic Defense Initiative, but most people recall it as Star Wars, largely because at the time it sounded more like science fiction than an actual military operation. But the fundamental concept behind Star Wars was nothing to dismiss lightly. If the United States actually possessed a successful space-based anti-missile system, that would essentially eliminate the long-standing deterrent of mutually assured destruction from the nuclear warfare equation. For decades, the greatest deterrent to actually deploying a nuclear weapon against an adversary was the understanding that as soon as you initiate a strike to annihilate them, they are going to launch their own missiles that will annihilate you. Total warfare became a lose-lose scenario. But if the United States possesses this global defense system, it would grant them unrestricted freedom to destroy anything they desire with no threat of significant retaliation. The Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, did not find that concept particularly appealing. So, he devoted substantial time on the international platform attempting to persuade Mr. Reagan that there was no necessity to proceed with this entire Star Wars initiative because the Soviet Union wasn't actually interested in attacking anyone with nuclear weapons. Everyone should just remain calm. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of all this, Gorbachev's engineers had already commenced work on a Death Star. And in fairness to Gorbachev, this is a project that had been underway long before he assumed control of the Soviet Union. You see, the Americans had been significantly overselling this entire Star Wars concept. They didn't genuinely possess the technology to construct an orbital defense network. And even if they did, the expense of it all would have been financially impossible. The problem was that the Soviets had vastly overestimated what the United States was promoting. So they developed a response that was equally as extreme. They didn't actually designate their project the Death Star. They called it Skiff, which is named after an ancient warrior tribe from Central Asia known as the Scythians, which many interpret to mean barbarian. The concept was that if America possessed satellites that could destroy their missiles, then the Soviets would construct an orbital battle station that could destroy those satellites. And to achieve this, it would employ a massive laser cannon. So, you can understand where the Death Star comparisons originate from. But engineering a laser that would function in space on an orbital platform was no simple undertaking. And we don't know precisely how the Soviet weapon was constructed. But we do know that they utilized a carbon dioxide-based laser. Here's a simplified examination of how that operates. First, you inject carbon dioxide gas into a large tube. Then, you energize that gas by shocking it with a massive amount of electricity, which will cause the carbon dioxide molecules to begin emitting light. Then, you reflect that light back and forth between two mirrors to intensify it into a beam. After you've accumulated sufficient energy, you release the beam from the tube where it passes through a lens that will concentrate the light like a magnifying glass. And that's your laser. So the more electricity you inject in there, the stronger your beam of light will become. And the laser that the Soviets constructed for their Skiff was reported to utilize 1 megawatt of power, which is sufficient to supply approximately 500 American households. It was a substantial laser, and that meant that the battle station constructed around it had to be equally as massive. The Skiff would be 40 meters in length, 4 meters in diameter, and weigh in at 95 metric tons, making it longer and heavier than the Space Shuttle orbiter. It would be one of the largest objects ever deployed into space. So to accomplish that, the Soviets would require an exceptionally powerful rocket booster to actually transport their giant laser battle station into orbit. This is where Energia enters the picture. On the surface, the Energia rocket booster was designed to launch the Buran shuttle. Yes, the Soviets possessed a very short-lived replica of the space shuttle, and that's an entirely different video. But aside from that single mission, Energia could function as a standalone rocket and lift over 100 metric tons of payload to low Earth orbit. Now, in theory, the Soviets have their Death Star, and they have their giant rocket booster, and they are prepared to assert their military supremacy over outer space. But that's the issue with so many of these Cold War space concepts. They sound impressive as propaganda, and they probably even appeared impressive on paper until reality intervenes. Just like the American Star Wars satellite network, Skiff was a genuinely terrible idea, and Gorbachev recognized it. He was fully aware of how provocative it would be to launch a giant space laser into orbit. He knew that the Americans weren't actually going to deploy their constellation of military satellites. And he also knew that the Soviet Union was rapidly, approaching bankruptcy almost entirely because of absurd overspending on insane military projects like a Death Star. But they'd already constructed the skiff and the Energia, and what little money the Soviets had remaining was already invested in this entire project. So they decided to simply proceed and execute it anyway. Only the more the Soviets worked, the more they realized that their ambitions had far surpassed their capabilities. And the 1-megawatt laser cannon was simply too large and complex to achieve functionality in any reasonable time frame. So, they renamed the spacecraft to Skiff D, and they settled for a considerably smaller carbon dioxide laser cannon, one that the Soviet military had already been testing on large jet aircraft. But even that began to become excessively challenging for Gorbachev. He was not nearly as invested in military posturing as many of his predecessors. His administration brought a new direction to the Soviet Union known as perestroika, or restructuring. It was fundamentally about withdrawing from the Cold War. You probably recognize this man's name best from the famous Ronald Reagan quotation, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And that's what he did. The Berlin Wall came down, and that signified the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. So, it's truly no surprise that under his leadership, the Soviet Death Star went from possessing a giant laser to a medium laser to eventually no laser whatsoever. The disarmed spacecraft was renamed to Skiff DM, and in fairness, they weren't completely neutralizing the battle station. It still possessed the targeting system for the laser that was going to be tested in orbit using inflatable balloons as substitutes for American satellites. So they still intended to prove that they could strike something with a laser in space if they genuinely wanted to. As a further disguise for the military nature of the skiff, the Soviet technicians painted the name Mir 2 on the exterior, theoretically to convince American intelligence operatives that this was simply another harmless space station. But ultimately, the spacecraft was renamed to Polyus, which translates to polar, and given their location, it's reasonable to assume that the Soviets meant North Pole. So from barbarian to Santa Claus, nothing to be concerned about here. The only peculiar thing is that because Polyus is so elongated, it actually has to be attached to the booster inverted in order to keep the power and propulsion module as far away from the booster's rocket engines as possible. But in space, there really is no up and down, so it shouldn't matter either way. At least that's what they presumed. And in the spring of 1987, the Energia rocket booster carrying the Polyus spacecraft ignited in a midnight launch from the desert of Kazakhstan. For the inaugural test of such an exceptionally powerful rocket, everything actually proceeded shockingly well. Energia lifted off the launch pad at a slight angle, but it corrected itself and powered its way through the atmosphere. At 7 minutes into the flight, Polyus is prepared to separate from the Energia core. All that the spacecraft has to do is drift away from its booster, rotate itself 180 degrees to get right side up again, and then ignite its engines to reach orbital velocity. And that's essentially what the spacecraft did, except for one minor complication. In their rush to prepare the Polyus ready for launch, the Soviets had made a practical decision to simply reuse an existing guidance computer from their Soyuz capsule. All they genuinely needed to do was reach low Earth orbit. That's already what the Soyuz computer was programmed to accomplish. So easy solution. Except the Soyuz was never designed to launch inverted. So as soon as the Polyus rotated itself 180 degrees, the guidance computer malfunctioned and rotated it back another 180 degrees. And then the main engines ignited. So all of the thrust that was intended to propel the spacecraft into orbit was now being directed straight, back down towards the surface of the Earth. And that was the final journey of the Soviet Death Star. Just 10 minutes after launch, the giant spacecraft impacted the atmosphere at incredible velocity and broke apart into hundreds of pieces of flaming debris that rained down over the Pacific Ocean. A peculiar end for a peculiar concept in a peculiar time, and now 4 decades later, it's all occurring again. Only this time we might actually possess the technology to accomplish it. Donald Trump wants to construct his own Star Wars, the Golden Dome, and somewhere in the world, someone is constructing their response. What will it be this time?